Margaret Chen's hands trembled as she stared at the official notice clipped to her mailbox. The letterhead bore the imposing seal of Willowbrook Gardens Homeowners Association, but the words beneath it made her stomach lurch with a sickening dread. Mandatory community fee deduction, it read, to be automatically withdrawn from Social Security benefits effective immediately. Her oxygen concentrator hummed steadily beside her wheelchair, the familiar sound now seeming ominous in the morning silence. Down the street, similar notices fluttered in the October breeze, each one a harbinger of financial devastation for the residents of Willowbrook Gardens, who depended on their modest disability checks to survive. The retirement community, once a haven of modest ranch homes and accessible pathways, had become a battleground overnight. Margaret's neighbor, David Rodriguez, a Vietnam veteran with a prosthetic leg, stood in his doorway reading the same notice, his face pale with disbelief. "This can't be legal," David called out, his voice carrying across the manicured lawn that separated their homes. "They can't just take our benefits like this." Margaret wheeled her chair closer to the property line, her breathing labored from the effort. The notice crumpled in her arthritic fingers as she tried to process the implications. $700, nearly half of her monthly Social Security check, was being claimed by the HOA as compensation for what they termed community enhancement services. The architect of this financial assault was Karen Blackwood, the newly elected HOA president, whose campaign promises of fiscal responsibility had taken a dark turn. Karen had moved to Willowbrook Gardens 18 months ago, purchasing the largest home in the development with cash from her divorce settlement. Her pristine white SUV with its pre-S vanity plate had become a symbol of dread as it patrolled the streets, Karen's sharp eyes cataloging every perceived violation of her expanding list of community standards. In the cramped community center that served as the HOA's headquarters, Karen stood before a whiteboard covered in financial projections and legal precedents she'd researched obsessively. Her immaculate blonde hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her designer blazer gave her an air of corporate authority that intimidated the elderly residents who made up the majority of the community. Behind her, Tom Morrison, the HOA's treasurer and Karen's most loyal supporter, shuffled through files with the nervous energy of someone who knew they were crossing dangerous lines. The Federal Housing Administration guidelines clearly state that communities can assess fees for essential services, Karen announced to the small crowd of board members and residents who had gathered for the emergency meeting. "These people are draining our resources with their special accommodations and medical equipment. It's only fair that they contribute their share." Her voice carried the cold precision of someone who had convinced herself that cruelty was merely pragmatism. Margaret had asked her son Robert to drive her to the meeting, knowing that she needed a witness to whatever was about to unfold. Robert, a civil rights attorney who specialized in disability law, sat tensely beside his mother's wheelchair, his laptop open and recording every word. The legal implications of Karen's proposal were staggering, but what horrified him more was the casual way she dismissed the human cost of her actions. "You're talking about stealing from people who can barely afford their medications," Robert said, his voice steady despite the anger burning in his chest. "Social Security benefits are protected by federal law. This isn't just morally wrong. It's a federal crime." Karen's smile was as cold as January frost as she turned to face him, her manicured fingers drumming against the podium with calculated patience. "Mr. Chen, isn't it I've done my research? The Community Housing Enhancement Act of 2019 gives homeowners associations broad discretion in fee assessment. Your mother signed the HOA agreement when she moved here, which includes provisions for emergency financial measures." Karen's voice dripped with false sympathy. "I understand this is difficult, but we all must make sacrifices for the greater good of the community." The room erupted in voices of protest as other residents began to grasp the full scope of Karen's plan. Mrs. Patterson, an 80-year-old woman who relied on a walker to get around, struggled to her feet with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "I worked 40 years as a schoolteacher to earn my benefits. How dare you call it a sacrifice when you're taking food from our tables?" Her voice cracked with emotion, but her words rang with the authority of someone who had spent decades facing down difficult situations. David Rodriguez had wheeled himself to the front of the room, his prosthetic leg clicking against the tile floor with each movement. The Purple Heart pinned to his jacket caught the fluorescent light as he leaned forward to address Karen directly. "I lost my leg serving this country, and now you want to steal the benefits I earned with my blood? You're not just wrong. You're evil." His words carried the weight of someone who had seen real evil and recognized it when it appeared in suburban clothing. Karen's composure cracked for just a moment, revealing the naked ambition beneath her carefully constructed facade. Emotional manipulation won't change the facts. This community is facing a financial crisis, and we need innovative solutions. The disabled residents consume disproportionate resources: wheelchair ramps, accessible parking, modified landscaping. It's time they paid their fair share. She gestured toward a presentation slide showing projected costs for disability accommodations, each number highlighted in accusatory red. The meeting dissolved into chaos as residents shouted over each other, some supporting Karen's position, while others condemned it with increasing fury. Margaret sat in her wheelchair, overwhelmed by the hostility swirling around her. She had moved to Willowbrook Gardens 3 years ago after her husband's death, seeking peace and community in her final years. Instead, she found herself at the center of a battle that threatened to destroy everything she had worked for. Over the following weeks, Karen's plan moved forward with military precision. Legal notices were distributed to every resident who received federal benefits, accompanied by detailed explanations of how the deductions would be processed. The HOA had apparently hired a collection agency specializing in government benefit garnishment, and their representatives appeared at board meetings with contracts and procedural manuals that made the theft seem almost legitimate. Robert Chen worked 18-hour days preparing legal challenges, but Karen had chosen her timing carefully. The notices were scheduled to take effect during the holiday season, when federal offices would be closed and legal remedies would be delayed. By the time the courts reopened, the damage would be done, and dozens of vulnerable residents would be facing eviction or worse. The first deduction appeared on Margaret's bank statement on December 15th, $700, withdrawn without her consent or authorization, leaving her with barely enough money to pay for her medications and oxygen supplies. The automated phone system at the Social Security Administration offered no help, and the local office was closed for the holidays. Margaret sat in her kitchen, staring at the statement, while her oxygen concentrator wheezed in the background like a mechanical death rattle. "Mom, we're going to fight this," Robert said, his voice tight with controlled rage as he reviewed the bank statement. "I've already filed emergency motions with the federal district court. This is a clear violation of the Social Security Act, and Judge Martinez has agreed to hear our case." But even as he spoke, Robert knew that legal victories were hollow comfort to people who couldn't afford their next meal. The community center had become a war room, with residents gathering daily to share information and coordinate their resistance. David Rodriguez had organized a phone tree to keep everyone informed of legal developments, while Mrs. Patterson used her teaching skills to help residents understand their rights. The atmosphere was electric with determination, but underneath lay the desperate fear of people who had nowhere else to turn. Karen's response to the legal challenges was swift and merciless. She hired a team of corporate lawyers who specialized in HOA law, and they began issuing violation notices to anyone who spoke out against the assessment. Parking citations, landscaping violations, noise complaints, Any pretense would serve to harass and intimidate the residents who dared to oppose her authority. The pressure campaign reached its peak when Karen announced that any resident who continued to protest the assessments would be subject to foreclosure proceedings. The HOA's legal team had discovered an obscure provision in the community's governing documents that allowed them to place liens on properties for unpaid assessments, and they were prepared to use it as a weapon against anyone who resisted. Margaret received her foreclosure notice on Christmas Eve. The document, delivered by a process server who apologized for the timing, stated that her failure to pay the assessment had resulted in a lien against her property. She had 30 days to pay the full amount, plus legal fees, or the HOA would begin proceedings to seize her home. The irony was not lost on her. She was being threatened with homelessness for refusing to allow the theft of benefits she had earned through decades of hard work. "This is terrorism," David said, his voice shaking with fury as he read his own foreclosure notice. "She's using our homes as hostages to force us to accept her theft. This isn't about community fees. It's about power and control." He crumpled the notice in his fist, the paper making a sound like breaking bones in the silence of his living room. The turning point came when Mrs. Patterson collapsed during a board meeting, her blood pressure spiking from the stress of Karen's intimidation campaign. As the paramedics wheeled her away on a stretcher, Karen stood at the podium and calmly announced that the meeting would continue as scheduled. The callousness of the moment was captured on video by Robert's phone, and the footage would later become crucial evidence in the federal investigation. "You're killing people," Robert said, his voice barely controlled as he watched his mother's friend being loaded into the ambulance. "This obsession with money is literally destroying lives. How much blood do you need on your hands before you realize you've gone too far?" Karen's response was a shrug of feigned helplessness, as if the consequences of her actions were beyond her control. The federal court hearing was scheduled for January 8th, but Karen had no intention of waiting for a judge's decision. She accelerated the foreclosure timeline, hoping to force residents into compliance before the courts could intervene. Process servers appeared at dawn, delivering final notices to every resident who had challenged the assessments. The message was clear: submit or lose everything. Robert worked through the night preparing emergency motions, but he knew that legal procedures moved slowly while Karen's assault on the community continued at breakneck speed. The residents were caught in a terrible bind. They couldn't afford to pay the assessments, but they also couldn't afford to lose their homes. The stress was taking a visible toll, with several residents requiring medical attention for anxiety and depression. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Sarah Williams, a local reporter who had been following the story, discovered that Karen's legal team had made a critical error in their research. The Community Housing Enhancement Act that Karen had cited as justification for the assessments actually contained specific exemptions for Social Security benefits, exemptions that her lawyers had either overlooked or deliberately ignored. "This changes everything," Robert said, his voice filled with hope for the first time in weeks as he reviewed Sarah's findings. "Not only is what they're doing illegal, it's a federal crime with mandatory jail time. Karen and her lawyers have walked straight into a trap of their own making." The evidence was overwhelming, and Robert knew that Judge Martinez would have no choice but to issue an emergency injunction. The federal court hearing drew media attention from across the state. Television news crews lined the courthouse steps, their cameras capturing the drama of elderly residents in wheelchairs and on walkers facing off against Karen's team of expensive lawyers. The visual contrast was stark: vulnerable people fighting for their survival against corporate power wrapped in legal jargon. Judge Martinez entered the courtroom with the bearing of someone who had seen every form of legal manipulation and was not impressed by clever arguments that ignored basic human decency. Her reputation for protecting civil rights was well established, and Karen's lawyers seemed to shrink as she took her seat behind the bench. The judge's eyes scanned the packed courtroom, taking in the faces of residents who had been pushed to their breaking point. "Before we begin, I want to make something clear," Judge Martinez said, her voice carrying the authority of decades on the federal bench. "This court will not tolerate any action that violates the constitutional rights of American citizens, regardless of the legal technicalities that may be cited as justification. The law exists to protect people, not to enable their exploitation." Karen's lead attorney, a sharp-dressed man named Bradley Thornton, rose to present the HOA's case with the confidence of someone who had never lost a civil proceeding. "Your Honor, the Willowbrook Gardens HOA is simply exercising its legal right to assess fees for community services. The residents agreed to these terms when they purchased their properties, and the law clearly supports our position." His argument was technically sound, but morally bankrupt, and everyone in the courtroom could feel the judge's growing irritation. Robert's presentation was devastating in its simplicity. He displayed the Federal Register entry that explicitly protected Social Security benefits from garnishment, then showed the court documents proving that Karen's team had ignored this protection. "Your Honor, this isn't a civil dispute. It's attempted theft of federal benefits, a crime that carries serious penalties under federal law. The defendants have essentially confessed to their crimes in their own legal filings." The courtroom fell silent as Judge Martinez reviewed the evidence. Her expression grew darker with each document, and when she finally looked up, her eyes were blazing with judicial fury. "In 30 years on this bench, I have rarely seen such a blatant violation of federal law disguised as legitimate legal action. The defendants have not only committed theft, but have done so with a callousness that shocks the conscience." Karen sat rigid in her chair, her carefully constructed facade cracking under the weight of the judge's words. For the first time since the crisis began, she seemed to understand that her legal protections were illusions, and that the federal government would not tolerate her assault on its most vulnerable citizens. The color drained from her face as she realized that her quest for power had led her into a trap with no escape. "I am issuing an emergency injunction ordering the immediate return of all funds taken from Social Security benefits," Judge Martinez announced, her voice ringing with authority. "Furthermore, I am referring this case to the FBI for criminal investigation, and I am placing the Willowbrook Gardens HOA under federal supervision until this matter is resolved." The gavel's bang echoed through the courtroom like a thunderclap, marking the end of Karen's reign of terror. The aftermath was swift and decisive. Federal agents arrived at the community center within hours, seizing financial records and interviewing residents about the intimidation campaign. Karen's lawyer abandoned her case, citing ethical concerns about continuing to represent someone who had clearly committed federal crimes. The collection agency that had processed the benefit garnishments was also under investigation, their license suspended pending a full review of their practices. Margaret Chen's bank account was restored within 48 hours. The stolen funds returned with interest, as ordered by the federal court. But the money was less important than the victory itself. The knowledge that even the most vulnerable members of society were protected by laws that could not be circumvented by clever legal arguments or corporate intimidation. "We won," David said, his voice filled with wonder as he read the news report about Karen's arrest. "She's actually going to jail for what she did to us. I never thought I'd see the day when someone would actually face consequences for attacking disabled people." His words carried the weight of a lifetime of fighting for recognition and respect, struggles that had finally been vindicated by the federal courts. The community center became a celebration venue as residents gathered to share their relief and gratitude. Mrs. Patterson, recovered from her medical emergency, led a toast to the federal justice system that had protected them when local authorities had failed. The atmosphere was jubilant, but underneath lay a deeper understanding of how fragile their protections truly were. Karen's sentencing hearing drew even more media attention than the original trial. The federal prosecutors had discovered that her scheme was not unique. She had attempted similar benefit garnishments in 2 previous communities, always moving on before facing legal consequences. The pattern of predatory behavior convinced Judge Martinez that prison time was necessary to prevent future victims. Mrs. Blackwood, you have systematically targeted the most vulnerable members of our society for financial exploitation, Judge Martinez said, as she prepared to impose sentence. Your actions were not merely illegal. They were a betrayal of the basic human decency that holds communities together. The court sentences you to 18 months in federal prison, followed by 2 years of supervised release, during which you are prohibited from serving in any HOA leadership position. The federal oversight of Willowbrook Gardens lasted 6 months, during which time new leadership was elected and community bylaws were rewritten to prevent future abuse. The residents who had been targeted by Karen's schemes were given priority in the new governance structure, ensuring that their voices would be heard in all future decisions. The transformation was remarkable. A community that had been torn apart by greed and intimidation was rebuilt on principles of mutual respect and support. Margaret Chen was elected to the new HOA board, her wheelchair no longer a symbol of vulnerability, but of strength and perseverance. Her first official act was to establish a community fund to help residents facing financial emergencies, funded by voluntary donations rather than mandatory assessments. The fund's charter specifically protected it from any attempt to garnish government benefits, a safeguard that would prevent future Karen Blackwoods from exploiting the community's most vulnerable members. We learned something important about ourselves, Margaret said during her acceptance speech. We learned that we're stronger together than we are apart, and that our differences make us stronger rather than weaker. Karen tried to divide us by making disability a burden to be resented, but we proved that diversity is our greatest strength. Her words were met with sustained applause from residents who had discovered their own power through adversity. The federal investigation expanded beyond Willowbrook Gardens, uncovering a network of HOA management companies that specialized in exploiting elderly and disabled residents. The scheme was sophisticated, involving legal firms that provided template documents and collection agencies that processed benefit garnishments without questioning their legality. The scope of the conspiracy shocked federal prosecutors, who had initially viewed Karen's case as an isolated incident. Robert Chen was approached by the Department of Justice to serve as a consultant on HOA reform legislation. His experience in defending his mother's community had revealed systemic weaknesses in the laws governing homeowners associations, gaps that allowed predators like Karen to operate with impunity until their victims had suffered irreparable harm. The proposed legislation would require federal oversight of any HOA that managed communities with significant disabled populations. My mother's fight wasn't just about money. It was about dignity and respect. Robert testified before Congress during hearings on the proposed legislation. Disabled Americans have earned the right to live in their communities without fear of exploitation or intimidation. The law must protect them from those who would prey on their vulnerabilities. His testimony was broadcast nationwide, inspiring similar legislative efforts in dozens of states. The story of Willowbrook Gardens became a case study in law schools and social work programs, an example of how individual courage could challenge systemic injustice. Students analyzed the legal strategies that had defeated Karen's scheme, but they also studied the community organizing that had sustained the residents through their darkest hours. The lesson was clear. Legal victories were meaningless without the human solidarity that gave them power. Karen served her full sentence in federal prison, her time made more difficult by the knowledge that her crimes had been motivated by nothing more than personal greed and social prejudice. Her fellow inmates, many of whom had disabled family members, were not sympathetic to her situation. She was released quietly, her parole officer noting that she had shown no genuine remorse for her actions. The Willowbrook Gardens Community Center now features a memorial plaque honoring the residents who fought back against Karen's tyranny. The inscription reads, "In memory of those who refused to surrender their dignity to intimidation and greed." Their courage reminds us that justice is not a gift from those in power, but a right that must be defended by ordinary citizens willing to stand up for what is right. Margaret Chen lived for 3 more years after the victory, her final years marked by the peace and security that had been threatened by Karen's assault on the community. She died surrounded by neighbors who had become family, people who understood that her fight had been their fight, and that her victory had been their victory. The community she had helped save continued to thrive, a testament to the power of ordinary people to defend extraordinary principles. The federal oversight program established at Willowbrook Gardens became a model for communities across the country, its success proving that government protection of vulnerable citizens was not only morally necessary, but practically effective. The program's annual reports documented not just the prevention of financial exploitation, but the flourishing of communities where disabled residents were valued as full and equal members rather than burdens to be managed. David Rodriguez often walked past the community center in the evenings, his prosthetic leg no longer a source of shame, but a symbol of his resilience. The building that had once been Karen's headquarters was now a place of learning and support, where residents gathered to share meals and stories, rather than endure lectures about fiscal responsibility. The transformation was complete. Fear had been replaced by hope, division by unity, and exploitation by justice. Years later, when young lawyers asked Robert Chen about the case that had defined his career, he would tell them that the most important lesson was not about legal strategy or federal jurisdiction, but about the power of ordinary people to defend extraordinary principles. My mother and her neighbors didn't win because they were lawyers or politicians, he would say. They won because they refused to accept that being disabled made them less deserving of dignity and respect. That's a lesson that transcends any legal precedent. The story of Willowbrook Gardens reminds us that justice is not an abstract concept, but a living principle that must be defended by each generation. Karen Blackwood's attempt to steal from the most vulnerable members of her community was defeated not by legal technicalities or political maneuvering, but by the simple refusal of decent people to accept indecency as normal. Their victory stands as a beacon of hope for all who face similar challenges. Proof that even the most powerful predators can be stopped when ordinary citizens find the courage to stand together in defense of what is right. The federal protection that saved Willowbrook Gardens was not just about money or legal precedent. It was about the fundamental promise of American democracy that all citizens, regardless of their physical abilities or economic circumstances, deserve to live with dignity and security. Margaret Chen, David Rodriguez, and their neighbors proved that this promise is not just words on paper, but a living commitment that must be honored by every generation. Their courage in the face of intimidation and their refusal to surrender their rights to those who would abuse them serves as an inspiration to all who believe that justice is not just an ideal, but a practical necessity for a society that claims to value human dignity above all else.